He stood in the elevator, adjusting the collar of the only good suit he owned, and told himself it was just dinner with an old friend, nothing more. The kind of quiet evening that men like Henry Roberts allowed themselves once in a long while, when the laundry was done and the permission slips were signed, and his daughter was safely asleep under the watch of a trusted babysitter. Just dinner, that was all. The elevator doors opened, and every quiet assumption Henry Roberts had made about the rest of his life began, slowly and without warning, to come undone. But what happened next? Nobody expected. Not Henry. Not the woman waiting at that table. Not even the man who had set the whole thing in motion. Henry Roberts was 38 years old. He carried his years the way a man carries a coat worn through every kind of weather, comfortably, without drama, with a dignity that came not from ease, but from endurance. He was the kind of man who showed up on time, kept his word, and had Sophie's lunch packed the night before so mornings didn't spiral into chaos. He was steady. He was reliable. By most measures, he was fine. But fine, as anyone who has ever been fine will tell you, is not the same thing as happy. His wife Claire had died 4 years earlier, suddenly, without warning, without time for goodbyes. Only the stunned aftermath of a man learning to hold together a household, a grief, and a 6-year-old daughter who still asks sometimes at bedtime whether Mama was ever coming home. Henry had answered that question in more ways than he could count. He had answered it while loading the dishwasher and signing permission slips. He had answered it at school plays and soccer games and pediatrician appointments, in the delays, particular silence of a house where all the furniture still remembered a woman who was no longer there. And somewhere in the years between Claire's death and that October evening, Henry had quietly stopped expecting anything for himself. Not out of bitterness. There was very little bitterness in him, but out of something more, resigned and private. The way a man learns to eat alone and eventually stops noticing that the other chair is empty. His mornings began at 5:30, not because he needed to be up that early, but because the hour before Sophie woke was the only time the house was entirely his. He made coffee in the dark, stood at the kitchen window, watching the neighborhood gather light, and ran through the mental checklist that had become the architecture of his days. Dry cleaning to pick up, parent-teacher conference on Thursday, the water heater making that sound again, a birthday gift for Sophie's best friend, whose party was on Saturday. His work, project management at a mid-size construction firm, was a place where Henry excelled, because the skill of keeping many moving parts from colliding was a skill he had already been practicing at home for years. He was good at it. He was steady. He was, by most measures, fine. Then Marcus Webb called. Marcus was an old friend from college, the kind of easy, uncomplicated friendship that had survived geography and diverging lives and long gaps in communication. He called on a Tuesday afternoon to thank Henry for something that had happened 3 years ago, when Marcus had been going through a genuinely difficult time, a business failure, a broken engagement, a stretch of dark months he didn't often discuss. Henry had done nothing extraordinary, at least not by his own accounting. He had shown up, listened, lent what money he could spare, and made sure Marcus knew he wasn't alone. Marcus apparently had not forgotten. "I want to do something for you," Marcus said, with the warmth of a man who had been carrying a debt of gratitude for longer than was comfortable. "Not as payment, just as a thank you. There's a restaurant, the Meridian. I want to take you to dinner." Henry hesitated. He was not particularly comfortable being thanked, especially for things he considered simply what a person did for someone they cared about. But Marcus was persuasive, and Henry was tired, and the path of least resistance was to say yes. Just dinner, Henry told himself, setting the cream-colored envelope on the kitchen counter. That evening after Sophie had gone to sleep. Just a meal with an old friend. He didn't look at it again until Saturday morning. A table reserved at the Meridian, the rooftop private dining room, this coming Friday at 7. He sat it down beside his coffee cup and thought nothing further of it. He had no reason to. What Henry did not know, could not have known, was that the dinner he was walking toward had been arranged with a precision and intentionality that had nothing to do with Marcus Webb's gratitude, and everything to do with a woman named Isabella Carter, who had heard Henry's name spoken in 3 separate conversations over the course of 2 months, and found herself thinking about a man she had never met. Can you imagine hearing someone described, just their name, just a few words about who they are, and feeling something shift inside you before you've stayed, as another wanes. That is exactly what happened to Isabella Carter. Isabella was 35 years old, and she had built her life into something that looked from the outside like everything anyone could want. She was the chief executive officer of Carter Meridian Group, a real estate and development conglomerate that had grown under her leadership from a regional firm into a company valued at several $billion. She was the kind of woman who appeared on the covers of business publications without having sought the attention, who gave speeches that people remembered weeks later, who walked into rooms and changed the temperature of them without visibly trying. She was brilliant, in the way that genuinely brilliant people are. Not showy about it, but efficient, precise, capable of holding an entire strategic landscape in her mind, while simultaneously tracking the human details in front of her. She had built the Meridian restaurant herself, as part of a larger development project. The rooftop dining room, with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city lights, had been quietly one of her favorite places to think. But behind the composure, behind the professional reputation, and the corner office, and the sleek apartment that was decorated in a way that looked warm, but rarely felt it, Isabella was a woman who had been disappointed by people enough times to build very specific walls around the parts of herself that could still be hurt. She had been in 2 serious relationships. The first man had been charming, right up until the moment his business failed, and then he had started looking at her the way a drowning person looks at a life raft, not with love, but with need. The second had been subtler, more sophisticated, and therefore more damaging. A man who genuinely seemed to care for her, but could not tolerate her success, who had slowly, methodically tried to make her smaller until she finally understood what was happening and walked away. After that, she had stopped looking, not dramatically, not with bitterness. Isabella did not do things dramatically, but with the quiet efficiency of someone who has updated a strategy based on new information. She did not need a partner. She had a company. She had work she loved. She was, by most measures, fine. The first time she heard Henry's name was from her assistant Dana, who mentioned him in passing, while discussing a charity fundraiser the company had sponsored. Dana's younger brother had gone through a difficult stretch several years ago, and Henry, a family friend, had shown up in ways that Dana described with simple, unelaborate admiration. "He's just a good person," Dana said, in the tone of someone describing something genuinely rare. Isabella had filed the name away without intending to. The second time was at a dinner party, where a mutual acquaintance mentioned a man named Henry Roberts, who had quietly helped keep a small community center funded during a period when its grants had fallen through, not because he had money to spare, but because he had organized the community around the cause with the kind of steady, unglamorous persistence that actually gets things done. The third time was from Marcus, who had called Isabella's office to discuss a development project and ended up, in the way that conversations sometimes do, talking about a friend he owed a great deal to. "He's the kind of man," Marcus had said, "who never asks for anything in return, which is exactly why I want to do something for him." Something shifted in Isabella then, not a grand revelation, but a quiet click of attention, the feeling of a detail arranging itself into a pattern. She asked Marcus to describe him, and then she made a decision that, by her own admission later, was entirely unlike her. She asked to be the dinner, not as a setup exactly, not as a trick, but as an introduction, one she wanted to control on her own terms, in a setting she knew well, with the freedom to assess and be assessed, without the performance of a traditional blind date. Marcus had agreed with some amusement. He made the reservation. He sent the invitation. And Isabella spent the week before Friday doing something she almost never did, wondering how she would be perceived by a man she hadn't met yet. Henry arrived at the Meridian on Friday evening at 6:58, wearing the best suit he owned, the dark navy that Claire had helped him pick out years ago for a company awards dinner, and which he had dry cleaned with unusual care the day before. He stood in the lobby and felt immediately, acutely aware that he did not entirely belong there. The Meridian was the kind of place that existed in a register of wealth and elegance that Henry moved through occasionally, but never inhabited. The marble floors, the soft golden lighting, the particular silence of luxury that is different from ordinary quiet. A hostess materialized and led him to an elevator he hadn't noticed. When the doors opened onto the rooftop level, Henry stepped out into a space of floor-to-ceiling glass that revealed the city spread below them in all its nighttime luminosity. He thought briefly that Marcus must have done even better than he'd let on. The hostess led him to a private dining room at the far end, a room within a room, walled on 3 sides with glass, intimate and breathtaking at once. She opened the door. Henry walked in, and the evening he had expected, a comfortable meal, a glass of wine, easy conversation with an old friend, simply ceased to exist as a possibility, because the woman sitting at the table by the window was not Marcus Webb. She was Isabella Carter, and even if Henry had not recognized her immediately, which he did, because her face had appeared in publications he'd read and news segments he'd half-watched, he would have known from the quiet authority of her presence that this was someone entirely different from anyone he had imagined walking toward tonight. She stood as he entered. She was wearing a deep burgundy dress, simple and precise, and she looked at him with dark eyes that held something between amusement and genuine curiosity. She extended her hand. "Henry," she said. Her voice was lower than he'd expected, warmer. "I'm Isabella Carter. I'm your blind date." The silence that followed lasted approximately 3 seconds, and felt considerably longer. Henry shook her hand, because his body, blessedly, kept functioning even when his mind had gone entirely offline, and heard himself say with a composure he was not actually feeling, "I think there may have been some miscommunication." Isabella smiled. It was the smile of a woman who had anticipated exactly this response, and was not the slightest bit deterred by it. "There wasn't," she said simply. "Please, sit down." And because Henry Roberts was a man who, at his core, was polite to a degree that sometimes overrode his better judgment, he sat. The first 20 minutes were a masterclass in the particular awkwardness that descends when 2 people are trying to behave normally in a situation that is entirely abnormal. Henry kept his spine straight and his hands in his lap, and his expression carefully neutral. The posture of a man who is not panicking, who is definitely not panicking, who is simply a person sitting across from one of the most successful women in the city in a rooftop glass room, while, wearing a suit his late wife had picked out, he asked polite questions. He answered her questions politely. He thanked the waiter. He examined the menu with unnecessary thoroughness. Isabella, across the table, watched all of this with the attention of someone who is genuinely interested in what she dwells, and who is patient enough to let the thing she's looking at settle before she reaches for it. She was the one who shifted the register. It happened gradually, almost imperceptibly, the way a piece of music changes keys without announcing itself. She asked about his work, and when he described it, she asked a follow-up question that showed she's work actually absorbed his answer, rather than simply waiting for her turn to speak. She mentioned a neighborhood she'd grown up in on the east side of the city, and he recognized it, not well, but enough to say something real. The recognition loosened something between them. She told him, without fanfare, that she had heard about him from 3 different people over 2 months, and that she had found herself curious in a way she didn't usually allow herself to be. She said this without apology and without excessive elaboration, and Henry found that the directness of it, so different from the performance he's prano, was the first thing about the evening that made him actually relax. They talked for 2 hours. They discovered, in the way that genuine conversation discovers things, that they shared more than they would have predicted. Both had grown up in households where money was careful and love was not. Both had experienced the particular loneliness of being competent in public and uncertain in private. Both had, at different points in their lives, made a decision to protect themselves by shrinking their expectations, and both were, without having discussed it, still living with the consequences of that decision. None of this was said outright. It was present in the spaces between things. Henry talked about Sophie, without intending to say as much as he did. He started with a small story, a funny one, about Sophie's recent conviction that she could train the neighbor's cat to respond to commands, a project that had produced no results and no diminishment of enthusiasm, and the laughter it drew from. Isabella was genuine enough to encourage him further. He talked about the school play, where Sophie had played a tree and had given the tree an elaborate backstory that she explained to the audience during intermission. He talked about the particular quality of Sophie's questions at bedtime, which ranged from the practical to the philosophical, with no discernible transition, and somewhere in the telling, his voice changed. Not dramatically, but noticeably. The careful neutrality dropped away into something warmer, something less guarded. The voice of a man talking about the thing he loves most. When he mentioned Claire, briefly, carefully, the way he always did, Isabella didn't rush past it or redirect the conversation. She let it sit, and then she said quietly, "She sounds like she was a wonderful mother." Henry looked at her. "She was," he said. It was the simplest possible answer. It was also entirely true, and the relief of saying it simply, without needing to protect the statement or explain it, was something he hadn't expected to feel tonight. What Isabella felt, watching him, was something she recognized and had spent years being careful about. Real admiration, the kind that moves upward through respect and arrives somewhere more complicated. She had spent her professional life surrounded by people who wanted things, who came to meetings with agendas, who offered warmth as strategy, who performed generosity in ways that were very precise about their own visibility. Henry Roberts wanted nothing from her. Not once, in the 90 minutes they had been talking, had she seen him try to leverage who she was. He was not networking. He was not performing. He was not even trying to impress her, which was, in the end, the most impressive thing about him. The dinner ended, as dinners do, with a natural diminuendo. The dessert finished, the coffee cups empty, the conversation finding its way to a conclusion without either of them forcing it. Henry helped Isabella with her coat, because that was the kind of person he was, and stood with her in the elevator feeling the familiar return of formality as the real world reasserted itself. He thanked her. He said it had been unexpected and genuinely pleasant. He meant both things. Isabella looked at him with an expression he couldn't entirely read, and said, "I'd like to do this again." Henry nodded. "That would be nice," he said. He walked to his car and sat in it for a long moment before starting the engine, staring at the steering wheel with the expression of a man who has just walked through a door he cannot find. Again, from the outside. His phone buzzed. A text from Marcus. "Well?" Henry stared at the message for 10 seconds. Then he typed back, "You could have warned me." Marcus replied, "Where's the fun in that?" Henry set the phone down, started the car, and drove home through the lit city streets, telling himself firmly that whatever he was feeling was just the surprise of an unexpected evening, and that by morning it would have settled back into the regular shape of his life. He was wrong about that, but he didn't know it yet. In the days that followed, Henry did what Henry had learned to do with things that unsettled him. He managed them. Isabella texted, once on Saturday afternoon, once on Sunday evening. Brief, undemanding messages that asked nothing of him, but left a small bright residue of warmth. He replied promptly and cordially, and without opening any of the doors her messages seemed to knock lightly against. He told himself he was being realistic. She ran a billion-dollar company. He managed construction timelines. The ratio between those two realities was not something that good intentions could simply override. He told himself Sophie needed stability, not upheaval. He told himself he was too old and too tired and too used to his own life to start wanting something different. He had gotten very good, over the years, at talking himself out of wanting things. Isabella, who was accustomed to obstacles presenting themselves as something other than what they actually were, recognized what was happening with a clarity she found privately somewhat refreshing. She had expected some version of this, the polite withdrawal, the maintenance of careful distance. She was not offended. She was, if anything, more interested. A man who ran toward her immediately because of who she was would have confirmed the pattern she had spent years trying to escape. A man who pulled back, not out of disinterest, but out of the complicated self-doubt that comes from having been alone for a long time. That man was real, and she had decided, with the same focused determination she brought to every significant decision, that she was not going to let real slip away because she hadn't moved fast enough. She suggested coffee. He accepted because declining felt too pointed. They met at an ordinary cafe midway between their offices, and the ordinariness of it did something. Henry came in without the navy suit, in the clothes of his actual daily life. Isabella came without the precise armor of her executive presentation, her hair down, her coat oversized, and clearly chosen for warmth rather than appearance. They talked for 2 hours. She asked about his work with genuine technical curiosity, following his explanations about project sequencing with the quick comprehension of someone who actually understood structural logic. He asked about hers, and she answered without the careful editorializing she usually applied, talking about the parts that frustrated her as freely as the parts she loved. She told him about a community development initiative she'd had to shut down last year, undermined by contractors she had trusted too completely, and there was real feeling in her voice when she described it, not the performed feeling of someone wanting to seem relatable, the actual feeling of someone who had cared about something and watched it fail. He recognized the emotion. He had felt it himself, in different circumstances. "Most people just tell me I'll find a better opportunity next time," she said. "That's not what you needed to hear," he said. "No," she said. "It wasn't. It continued like this, gradually, without announcement, in the understated register of two, people who are not young, and who have both learned to move carefully with things that matter." They went for a walk in the park on a Sunday morning, when Henry's sister had Sophie for the day, and they talked for 3 hours without noticing the time. They ate from food trucks at a weekend farmer's market, standing at a folding table because there were no chairs, and Isabella ate a pulled pork sandwich with the same focus she brought to everything, and Henry laughed at a story she told about a disastrous corporate retreat in the mountains 3 years ago, and the laughter felt like something unlocking, something he had forgotten could happen. He found himself on Tuesday evenings looking at his phone with a particular kind of anticipation, not the anxious, suspended anticipation of uncertainty, but the warmer anticipation of someone expecting something good. It took him several weeks to identify this feeling clearly enough to name it, because it had been a very long time since he had felt it, and the name he arrived at surprised him with its simplicity. He was happy, not the managed contentment of his ordinary days, but actual happiness, the kind with voltage in it, the kind that makes the air feel slightly different. And then the photographs appeared. His colleague mentioned it with the careful tone of someone relaying information were not sure they should relay. There were pictures, in one of the cities, gossip-adjacent online publications, of Henry and Isabella at the farmer's market. The photographs were not embarrassing in themselves. They were simply photographs of two people eating sandwiches, but the captions were something else. The publication had described Henry as an unidentified man in one headline and as the mystery companion of CEO Isabella Carter in another, and the comments that had accumulated beneath these descriptions were the kind of comments that appear when a powerful woman is seen with an ordinary man, and the algorithm's primary directive is to generate engagement rather than produce anything resembling human decency. He was an opportunist. He was clearly after her money. He was punching so far above his weight, it was almost impressive. One commenter had found his name and workplace, and speculated with cheerful specificity about what he might be getting out of the arrangement. Henry read these things alone in his car, in the parking garage of his office building, and then he sat for a long time in the dark, doing the very specific kind of calculation that people do when they are trying to decide whether to do the brave thing or the safe thing. The brave thing would be to call Isabella, to tell her what he'd seen, to have a direct conversation, and let her decide how she felt. The safe thing, the thing that looked from the outside like consideration, but was actually fear, was to protect her from the situation by removing himself from it, by being, as he had always been, responsible, by making the sacrifice quietly and without drama, and letting her move on without having to deal with the mess of his uncertainty. He chose the safe thing. He stopped texting first. He replied to her messages with a delay that began to feel strategic rather than incidental. He declined a coffee, she suggested with a vague reason. And Isabella, who was not a woman who missed much, noticed immediately. She gave him a week. Then she called. He answered on the third ring, and before he could offer whatever preemptive social management he had prepared, she said, "I want to see you this week, before you find another reason not to." There was no anger in it exactly, but there was something that did not leave room for evasion. He said, somewhat lamely, that he had seen the articles, and that he didn't want to cause problems for her. She was quiet for a moment. "I have read the articles," she said, very evenly, "and I am asking you to come anyway. This Friday, same place we started." He held the phone for a long time after she hung up. Then he wrote a text to his sister, asking if she could take Sophie on Friday evening. Then he stared at the ceiling of his home office for 20 minutes. Then he ironed the navy suit. The rooftop private room looked the same as it had 3 months ago, but everything else was different, and they both knew it. Henry arrived first this time. He was the one who needed to speak, and the act of waiting gave him a moment to assemble the words he'd been avoiding for weeks. When Isabella walked in, she sat across from him without the social warm-up of a normal evening, looked at him directly, and said, "Tell me what you're actually afraid of." What followed was the most honest conversation Henry Roberts had had with another person in 4 years. He did not explain himself smoothly or eloquently. He said things badly and then rephrased them. He started sentences he couldn't finish and then found different sentences. He talked about the articles, not their content specifically, but what they had reflected back at him. The gap between who she was and who he was, rendered visible in public, the thing he had been managing privately, suddenly out in the open and subject to the judgment of strangers. He talked about not wanting to be the man who made Isabella Carter's life complicated, the man who became a liability, the man who needed her in a way that reduced her rather than added to her. And then, because he had gotten to the point in the conversation where he had nothing left to protect, he said it plainly. "I don't know how to be with someone like you without feeling like I'm the problem." Isabella looked at him for a long moment. "You have just described every version of being afraid," she said, with a precision and simplicity that disassembled his argument completely. "But you have not told me a single thing about what you want." He looked at her. The city below them was a sweep of light, indifferent and beautiful. He thought about 5:30 in the morning and the particular quality of Sophie's questions. He thought about the week when he had been expecting her messages and the afternoon in the park, when 3 hours had felt like 30 minutes. He thought about the pulled pork sandwich and her laugh and the moment she had told him about the failed project and the look on her face when he had said exactly the right thing without trying. "I want this," he said. "I want you. I've wanted it for weeks, and I've been trying to talk myself out of it, because it's enough. It's easier to be careful than to be wrong." She nodded slowly, like someone confirming information she had already gathered, but needed to hear stated plainly. Then she stood up from her chair, came around the table, and stood beside him where the window faced the city. He stood too, and when she reached up and took his face between her hands and looked at him with the steadiness of a woman who has made her decision and made it clearly, he stopped talking about it and simply let what was happening happen. The kiss was unhurried and certain, and below them, the city continued in its unconcerned luminosity, and inside that glass room on the top floor of the Meridian, the particular loneliness that had defined 2 separate lives, for too long, quietly ceased to be the primary fact about either of them. The months that followed were not a fairy tale. Both of them would have been suspicious of a fairy tale, and neither had the temperament to perform one. What they built instead was something more durable, a relationship assembled from actual knowledge of each other, from the slow accumulation of real moments that did not require narrative embellishment to be worth keeping. Isabella met Sophie for the first time on a Sunday afternoon in December at a children's science museum. Sophie assessed Isabella for approximately 45 minutes before announcing, without looking up from a display about the water cycle, "Are you Dad's girlfriend?" Isabella, sitting on a low bench beside her, said, "I'm his friend, and I like him very much. Does that make sense?" Sophie considered this. "It's a start," she said, and went back to the water cycle display. Henry, standing behind them, had to look away to conceal his expression. There were hard days. The adjustments required by 2 people who had each been self-contained for years are not trivial. There were moments when Henry fell back into his careful self-effacement, when he minimized his needs and agreed to things too quickly. Isabella called him on it. "You don't have to be so easy to please all the time. I'm not made of glass." He had laughed. She had not been laughing. He had understood. There were moments when her schedule consumed her in ways that were not compatible with the reliable rhythms of his life. He learned to say, on certain evenings, "I needed you to be here tonight, and you weren't." And she heard that, and she adjusted, not completely, not permanently, but meaningfully, in the ways that people adjust when they are genuinely trying, rather than merely managing. She had dinner at his house for the first time, on a Thursday evening in January. Henry made the meal himself, nothing complicated, a roasted chicken with root vegetables, bread from the bakery 3 blocks over. When Sophie came downstairs at 8 o'clock, ostensibly for a glass of water but observably for reconnaissance, Isabella had said hello, with the straightforward warmth of someone who had decided not to overthink the situation. Sophie had sat down at the table, uninvited but somehow entirely welcome, and asked Isabella whether she had ever been to Argentina, because Sophie had been reading about Argentina. Isabella had been to Buenos Aires twice on business. The conversation that followed lasted 40 minutes and covered Argentina, the history of trade routes, whether dinosaurs could theoretically have been domesticated, and Sophie's current theory about why the neighbor's cat refused all command training. Henry had washed the dishes and listened to them from the kitchen with his back turned, and the expression on his face during that conversation was one he was unaware of, one that he had not worn in years. He looked simply like a man who was home. Spring arrived. Henry noticed it in the way he noticed everything now, with more attention than he had been, giving to the world for years, as though something that had been turned down low had been slowly, gradually turned back up. He noticed the light changing on his morning commute. He noticed Sophie's improvement in soccer, with an involvement that felt less effortful, more natural. He ate lunch away from his desk. He called his sister more often. He told a colleague who had asked with genuine curiosity how he was doing the truth. "I'm well, really well." His colleague looked at him with the expression of someone who has known a person for a long time, and is noticing a change they're not sure they expected. "You look it," she said. He smiled. He didn't explain further. There was nothing to explain that would have been easier than just being seen as it. They were on the roof of the Meridian again on an evening in October, the years, full circle completed. The city below them exactly as it had been on the night they started. Isabella had suggested it, and Henry had agreed, and neither of them had said directly that they were marking something, but both of them knew. They sat at the same table. They ordered, coincidentally and correctly, the same things they had ordered a year ago. They talked about what the year had been, not the highlight reel version, but the honest version, the version that included the missteps and the difficult Thursdays, and the moments of real friction that they had worked through, because they had decided, separately and together, that working through things was worth it. Henry had grown, not dramatically, not in ways he could have predicted or explained, but he was more present than he had been, more willing to occupy the space he actually took up in the world. He apologized less for himself. He stated his preferences more clearly. He asked for things he wanted, and received them without seeming surprised. Isabella had changed too, in the slower, subtler way that people change when they have been given something they had stopped expecting. A witness, not a manager of their life, not an admirer of their achievements, but an actual witness. Someone who saw the ordinary, unperformed version and found it worth seeing. She called her mother more often. She laughed differently, more freely, less carefully, with the ease of someone who has stopped being cautious about being seen enjoying herself. The evening moved through dinner and into the slow, easy conversation of the dessert hour. The coffee came. The city below went about its unconcerned business, and Henry, who had been quieter than usual in the final half hour, reached into the inside pocket of the navy suit, the same suit, dry cleaned again, and set something on the table between them. It was small, in a dark box. He didn't open it immediately. He looked at her first. She looked at him. There was a stillness between them. Not the stillness of a held breath, but something more settled. The stillness of two people who have arrived somewhere together and are taking a moment to recognize it. "The first night we were here," he said, "you were the one who showed up as my blind date. You decided that. You arranged it. You took the risk." He paused. "And I spent most of this year being grateful for it, and half the time being too scared to say so." She reached across the table and put her hand over his. He looked down at their hands, then back at her. "This time, I want to be the one who shows up," he said. "I want to decide something." He opened the box. Inside was a ring, not elaborate, not showy. A single clear stone, in a setting that was precise and uncluttered, chosen by a man who had thought carefully about what the woman across from him would actually want to wear every day for work the rest of her life. "The first time," he said, "you called yourself my blind date. This time, I'm asking you something with no ambiguity at all." He paused. His voice was steady. "Will you be my partner? In the rest of this, in all of it." It was not a speech. It was not decorated with flourish or rehearsed with excessive polish. It was just the truth. stated simply by a man who had spent most of his adult life being careful and quiet about what he wanted, who had discovered in the past year that careful and quiet are not the same thing as honest. Isabella looked at him for a long moment, and her eyes, which were steady and direct and usually very composed, were not entirely dry. "You said no ambiguity," she said. He nodded. "Then yes," she said. "Obviously yes." She held out her left hand. He put the ring on her finger. It fit. Of course it fit. He had measured carefully. Outside the glass, the city moved through its ordinary night traffic and light, the living hum of a million lives arranged alongside one another. Inside, at a table by the window, two people who had separately concluded that they had probably had their best chances already sat with their hands together, and the future arranged in front of them like a landscape they hadn't been expecting, but recognized, from the first moment they saw it, as somewhere they had always been heading. Henry Roberts had thought he was going to a dinner. He had been right. He simply hadn't known, walking in through that door a year ago, that the thing waiting for him on the other side was not a meal, but a life. Not a replacement for what he had lost, but a continuation of who he was, carried forward by the unexpected grace of being truly seen by someone who had been looking, without knowing it, for exactly him. And Isabella Carter, who had spent years being the most successful person in every room she walked into, had finally found something that success could not provide and strategy could not manufacture. A home in another person, not in the architecture of a place, but in the quality of the presence, in the simple, irreducible fact of being known. They did not stay much longer. There was a daughter at home with a babysitter, and a morning that would arrive at the same time it always did, and a life to return to that was at last genuinely theirs. Henry helped Isabella with her coat. She straightened his lapel. They walked to the elevator together, and when the doors closed and the building carried them back down toward the city, they did not say anything, because there was nothing more that needed saying. They were both of them, for the first time in a long time, simply present. Inside the moment, inside the life, inside the quiet, ordinary, extraordinary fact of having found each other.